On December 21, 1945, the war was already over. The parades had been held, the medals handed out. The world was supposed to be moving on. And yet, on a quiet road near Mannheim, Germany, one American general was still thinking about the next war. His name was George Smith Patton Jr. At 11:45 in the morning, his staff car collided with a U.S. Army truck. The speed was low. The damage was minor. Everyone else in the vehicle walked away. Patton spoke after the crash. He joked. He complained about his neck. He even asked when he could go back to duty. 12 days later, he was dead. Official cause: complications from injuries sustained in a car accident. Official reaction: brief statements, quiet funerals, no investigation that mattered. And within weeks of his death, American war policy changed in ways that would define the rest of the 20th century. This is not a story about a conspiracy hidden in shadows. It's a story about power, timing, and what happens when a single voice disappears at exactly the wrong moment. Because George Patton was not just another victorious general, he was a problem. He was a problem for politicians who wanted stability, a problem for allies who wanted peace, and a problem for an enemy that had just become far more dangerous than Nazi Germany ever was. Patton believed the war had ended too soon and against the wrong opponent. While Washington spoke of cooperation, Patton spoke of confrontation. While others talked about rebuilding Europe, Patton talked about finishing the job. He openly criticized the Soviet Union while it was still officially an ally. He warned that Stalin was not a partner, but a future enemy. And most dangerously of all, he believed the United States had a narrow window of opportunity, a moment in history when the Red Army was exhausted, Europe was devastated, and American military power stood unmatched. That window, Patton believed, was closing fast. Unlike most generals, Patton didn't filter his thoughts. He wrote them. He said them out loud. He repeated them to journalists, officers, and politicians who wished he would simply stop talking. He compared Soviet rule to Nazi tyranny. He questioned why America had sacrificed so much only to hand Eastern Europe to another dictatorship. And he said something that chilled the men now in charge of U.S. policy. He said that if war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, then delaying it would only make it worse. To Patton, the greatest mistake of the Second World War was not fighting Germany, it was stopping. This attitude made him legendary among soldiers and deeply uncomfortable for leaders who were trying to sell peace to a war-weary public. The American people wanted their sons home. They wanted factories converted back to consumer goods. They wanted normal life. Patton wanted readiness. He wanted pressure. He wanted leverage. And he wanted it now. By late 1945, the United States stood at a crossroads. One path led toward negotiation, spheres of influence, and uneasy coexistence. The other led toward confrontation with a former ally whose intentions were becoming harder to ignore by the day. Patton stood firmly on one side of that divide. He was not subtle about it. He was not diplomatic, and he was not replaceable. In the internal debate shaping America's future, Patton represented something dangerous, a moral clarity that left little room for compromise. He believed power existed to be used, not managed. And he believed hesitation was how empires lost wars before they ever began. That made him popular with soldiers and expendable to policymakers. When the crash happened, no alarms were raised. No urgent questions were asked. No powerful voices demanded answers. The man who had survived battlefield chaos, artillery barrages, and armored warfare across Europe was gone, and the system absorbed the loss without resistance. But history doesn't only turn on dramatic moments. Sometimes it turns on silence. Because after Patton died, the arguments he had been making didn't win. They vanished. And what replaced them would shape the balance of world power for generations. The morning of December 21st began without ceremony. There were no warnings, no sense that history was about to change. Patton was no longer commanding armies. He was waiting for reassignment, waiting for Washington to decide what to do with a general who had won wars but refused to adapt to peace. He climbed into the back seat of a U.S. Army Cadillac sedan, a vehicle built for comfort, not combat. In the front sat his driver, Private First Class Horace Woodring. Beside him was Major General Hobart Gay, Patton's longtime chief of staff, and one of the few men who truly understood how Patton thought. They were heading out for a routine trip. Patton planned to go pheasant hunting. He was relaxed. Witnesses later said he was in good spirits, talking about the countryside, about history, about the wars of the past. The man who terrified enemies was, for once, unguarded. The road near Mannheim was straight and familiar. Military traffic was common. Army vehicles passed each other constantly in the ruins of post-war Germany. Nothing about the situation suggested danger. Then, without warning, a U.S. Army truck made a left turn across the sedan's path. The collision was sudden, but not violent by wartime standards. The Cadillac struck the truck at relatively low speed. There was no explosion, no fire. The front of the car crumpled, but the passenger compartment remained largely intact. Everyone survived the impact. Woodring was shaken but uninjured. Gay suffered cuts and bruises. Patton was conscious. He spoke immediately. He complained of pain in his neck and head. He joked that this was a ridiculous way for him to die after surviving the war. Witnesses later recalled that he seemed more annoyed than afraid. At the scene, no one believed his injuries were fatal. Patton was transported to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg. Doctors diagnosed him with a fractured third cervical vertebra. The injury left him partially paralyzed, but his condition appeared stable. He was alert. He communicated clearly. He even dictated notes. For days, the situation seemed under control. Then it wasn't. Despite modern medical care and constant attention, Patton's condition deteriorated. He developed complications: pulmonary embolism, heart failure. On December 21, 1945, just 12 days after the crash, George S. Patton Jr. was pronounced dead. The official explanation was straightforward. The accident caused the injury. The injury caused complications. The complications caused death. Case closed. Except the details never quite settled. The crash itself raised quiet questions. The speed was low. The damage was limited. No one else suffered serious harm. Even General Gay, seated beside the driver, escaped with minor injuries. Only Patton, seated in the back, sustained a fatal wound. Medical questions followed. Patton was a physically strong man. He had survived extreme stress for years, and yet his decline was rapid and final. There was no second chance, no recovery, no long-term treatment. More striking than the medical questions was the absence of political reaction. There was no major public investigation, no congressional inquiry, no sustained press campaign demanding answers. The death of one of America's most famous generals passed with remarkable speed through the machinery of government. Funeral arrangements were respectful but restrained. Patton was buried in Luxembourg, alongside the men of the Third Army he had commanded. It was a symbolic choice and a quiet one. In Washington, attention shifted almost immediately. There were meetings to attend, policies to finalize, a post-war world to manage. And within those meetings, one voice was suddenly missing. Patton had been difficult. He had been loud. He had been inconvenient. But he had also been a living reminder that the war had not ended cleanly, that unresolved power struggles were already taking shape. After his death, those warnings no longer disrupted the room. No memos needed to be rewritten. No speeches needed to be walked back. The path forward became simpler. History often records what happened. It rarely records what stopped happening. Because the moment Patton died, a certain kind of argument died with him. The argument that the United States should confront the Soviet Union while it still could. And in the silence that followed the crash, a different future began to take form. When news of Patton's death reached the American public, it landed softly. There were headlines. There were tributes. There were respectful words about bravery and service. But there was no national pause, no extended mourning, no sense that something fragile had just been lost. The war was over. People were tired. Another general dying in Europe felt like the closing of a chapter, not the beginning of a new one. Inside the U.S. military and political leadership, The reaction was even quieter. There were no urgent briefings convened to examine the implications of Patton's absence. No sudden push to preserve his ideas or continue his line of strategic thinking. His death was treated as a personal tragedy, not a strategic event. And that distinction mattered. Patton had been more than a battlefield commander. In the final months of 1945, he had become a disruptive force inside the American system, a man whose views did not align with where policy was heading, and who refused to soften them for the sake of unity. With him gone, that disruption ended overnight. Press coverage moved on quickly. Newspapers that had once followed Patton's every move now focused on reconstruction, demobilization, and the promise of peace. His more controversial statements were quietly omitted from retrospectives. The edges of his legacy were smoothed. In Washington, the absence was felt, but not publicly acknowledged. Meetings that once involved heated debate became more orderly. Discussions about the Soviet Union shifted in tone. Where Patton had spoken in absolutes, others spoke in probabilities. Where he had demanded action, others urged patience. No one announced a change in direction. No vote was taken. No policy document bore Patton's name crossed out. And yet, something fundamental had changed. The United States was transitioning from wartime decision-making to peacetime governance. That transition required consensus, predictability, and control. Patton had represented the opposite: volatility, moral certainty, and the willingness to gamble on force. In a system recalibrating for stability, his absence was not destabilizing. It was clarifying. Within weeks, the language used by American leaders began to shift. The Soviet Union was no longer discussed as a looming threat, but as a complex partner. Differences were framed as misunderstandings rather than ideological conflicts. Cooperation was emphasized. Confrontation was postponed. This wasn't because Stalin had become more trustworthy. It was because opposing voices had grown quieter. Patton had been one of the last senior figures willing to speak plainly about the nature of Soviet power. He did not believe in temporary alliances outlasting shared enemies. He believed in interests, force, and inevitability. Without him, those views lost their most visible champion. What replaced them was not weakness, but caution. A belief that the next war could be avoided through restraint, that time itself would resolve tensions, that the cost of confrontation was higher than the risk of delay. These were not irrational ideas. They were reasonable, measured, politically defensible. They were also unchallenged. And when ideas go unchallenged at moments of transition, they tend to harden into policy. By early 1946, the framework of America's post-war strategy was taking shape. Europe would be divided into zones of influence. The Red Army would remain where it stood. Germany would be managed, not mobilized. The priority would be recovery, not confrontation. This framework did not emerge because Patton died, but it emerged more easily because he was no longer there to oppose it. His death removed friction, and in politics, friction slows change. The silence that followed Patton's passing was not dramatic. It did not announce itself, but it created space for decisions to be made without resistance and for compromises to become permanent. History often remembers loud turning points. This one was quiet. And in that quiet, the United States began to move away from the path Patton had warned against, and toward a new kind of conflict, one defined not by tanks and generals, but by borders, influence, and time. In early 1946, there was no dramatic announcement that American strategy had changed, no speech declaring a new doctrine, no admission that the balance of power was being recalculated. The shift happened the way most lasting political changes do, quietly, through language, priorities, and omission. Only weeks earlier, senior military planners had openly discussed the possibility that cooperation with the Soviet Union would collapse. Contingency plans existed. Intelligence assessments warned that Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe were not temporary. There was unease, and in some circles, urgency. Patton had given that urgency a face. After his death, the sense of immediacy faded. Meetings that once explored worst-case scenarios began to emphasize diplomatic solutions. The idea of applying pressure while American military superiority was absolute lost traction. The cost of confrontation was elevated. The risks of inaction were downplayed. The assumption underlying these discussions was simple. Time favored stability. That assumption was never tested. It was accepted. President Truman, new to the presidency and acutely aware of public exhaustion, leaned toward restraint. The American people did not want another war. Congress wanted demobilization. Industry wanted conversion. Stability became the overriding objective. In this environment, Patton's worldview felt not just aggressive, but obsolete. Military budgets were cut. Troops were brought home. The massive wartime machine that had crushed Germany began to power down. Europe would be rebuilt, not rearmed. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was treated as a fixed reality. Its armies occupied Eastern Europe, and American policy quietly accepted that fact. Not because it was approved, but because challenging it seemed more dangerous than tolerating it. This was the moment the balance shifted. Before, the United States had leverage, unmatched force, intact infrastructure, and a monopoly on nuclear weapons. After, it chose not to use that leverage as a tool of pressure. Patton had argued that leverage decays. That power unused invites challenge. That waiting favors the side willing to consolidate quietly. Those arguments did not disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because they were inconvenient. The policy flip was not anti-Patton by name. It was post-Patton in effect. Where confrontation had once been considered, containment was adopted. Where decisive action had been debated, long-term management took its place. The goal was no longer to shape the post-war order quickly, but to prevent it from collapsing slowly. This approach would later be formalized. At the time, it was simply instinct. Accept the division of Europe. Avoid provoking Moscow. Trust that economic recovery and time would weaken extremism. It was a gamble, just a different kind than Patton had proposed. One was a gamble on action. The other was a gamble on delay. What made the shift possible was not unanimity, but absence. The absence of a figure powerful enough to force the uncomfortable question. What happens if the other side doesn't cooperate? By mid-1946, the United States had effectively chosen its post-war posture. Not war, but not peace. Not alliance, but not hostility. A long pause. That pause would later be called the Cold War. And it began not with a declaration, but with a decision not to press an advantage. A decision made easier by the loss of the man who most forcefully argued that advantages are temporary. To understand why Patton's absence mattered, it's necessary to confront an uncomfortable fact. What he was proposing was not fantasy. In the final months of 1945, the United States and its allies possessed an overwhelming advantage. Their economies were intact, their supply lines were secure, their armies were experienced, mobile, and well-equipped. And most importantly, their potential opponent was exhausted. The Red Army had won the war in the East, but at a catastrophic cost. Millions of soldiers were dead or wounded. Equipment was worn down. Logistics were stretched across a devastated continent. Soviet industry was recovering, but slowly. Patton understood this imbalance clearly. He believed the window would not remain open. That Soviet power, if left unchallenged, would consolidate behind occupied borders and grow stronger with time. What seemed like stability, in his view, was simply a pause before the next conflict. His solution was brutal in its simplicity. Apply pressure immediately. Force a settlement while leverage existed. Do not allow occupation to harden into permanence. Patton did not speak publicly about launching a new war. What he spoke about, privately and persistently, was the danger of inaction. He believed that once Soviet control over Eastern Europe became normalized, reversing it would require far more blood than preventing it in the first place. One of his most controversial ideas involved Germany. To Patton, the rapid demobilization and permanent disarmament of German forces was a strategic mistake. He did not see Germany as a future enemy. He saw it as a necessary counterweight. His argument was cold, not sentimental. Germany had manpower. Germany had industrial capacity. and Germany, freshly defeated, had every reason to oppose Soviet domination. Patton believed that using German units under Allied supervision to stabilize Europe was not only possible, but logical. To him, moral outrage was less dangerous than strategic blindness. This view horrified policymakers. The idea of rearming Germans so soon after the war was politically toxic. Public opinion would not tolerate it. Allied unity would fracture. The moral cost seemed unbearable. But Patton did not frame the issue morally. He framed it temporally. Do it now, he argued, or face a stronger enemy later. He also believed that the presence of American nuclear weapons changed the calculus entirely. The bomb was not just a weapon of last resort. It was leverage. It existed to shape outcomes before wars began, not after they escalated. In Patton's mind, the combination of exhausted Soviet forces, American nuclear monopoly, and Western industrial dominance created a moment unlike any other in history. And moments like that do not repeat. His ideas were discussed, not dismissed. They circulated quietly among officers and planners who understood the logic, even if they rejected the conclusions. This was not the thinking of a lone madman. It was one extreme within a real debate. What made Patton dangerous was not his aggression, it was his clarity. He stripped away the comforting illusion that peace could be managed indefinitely. He forced others to admit that delaying confrontation did not eliminate it, it merely shifted it to a future generation. When Patton died, this line of thinking did not vanish completely, but it lost its most uncompromising advocate, the man willing to say, without hesitation, that the price of avoiding a hard decision might be a harder war later. The path not taken was not guaranteed to succeed, but it was a path. And once Patton was gone, it closed. When a powerful figure disappears, the most important question is not who caused it, but who no longer has to resist it. Patton's death did not create winners in the obvious sense. No one celebrated publicly. No promotions were announced. No speeches acknowledged a shift in fortune. But the removal of his voice simplified the landscape for everyone who remained. For President Truman, Patton had been a liability. The administration was trying to manage a fragile transition from total war to uneasy peace. It needed discipline, message control, and predictability. Patton offered none of those. He spoke without clearance. He contradicted official positions. He embodied a version of American power that was difficult to restrain once unleashed. With Patton gone, civilian leadership regained control of the narrative. Policy could be shaped deliberately, without fear that a senior general would undermine it in public or force uncomfortable debates behind closed doors. For the military establishment, his absence restored balance. Patton was brilliant, but he was also destabilizing. He did not fit neatly into a peacetime hierarchy. He challenged assumptions. He forced the military to confront political realities it preferred to leave to civilians. Without him, command structures became more manageable. Promotions and assignments proceeded without friction. Strategic planning returned to consensus rather than confrontation. For America's allies, especially in Western Europe, Patton's death removed a source of anxiety. Many European leaders feared that a hard American turn against the Soviet Union would turn their shattered countries into the battlefield of a new war. Stability, even imperfect, felt preferable to renewed destruction. Patton's worldview threatened that fragile calm. His disappearance made restraint more credible. And then there was the Soviet Union. From Moscow's perspective, Patton was one of the few American commanders who spoke openly about the inevitability of conflict. His rhetoric was noted, his movements were monitored, his potential influence was understood. His death did not change Soviet behavior overnight, but it removed a variable, a man whose presence increased uncertainty. With Patton gone, American policy appeared more predictable. The likelihood of immediate confrontation decreased. Time could be used to consolidate gains, strengthen control over occupied territories, and rebuild power behind secure borders. No one needed to orchestrate his death for these benefits to exist. They were automatic. That is what made the situation so dangerous and so revealing. A single absence aligned the interests of rivals allies, and domestic leaders alike, not because they agreed on goals, but because they all preferred a future without Patton's kind of pressure. The uncomfortable truth is that history often rewards caution in the short term, even when it creates larger problems later. Patton represented risk. His death represented relief. Not relief from danger, but from decision. Because as long as Patton lived, the question remained open. Should the United States use its advantage now, or risk losing it forever? After he died, that question faded, and in its place emerged a quieter, more palatable choice: to wait, to manage, and to hope that the world would stabilize on its own. Hope is not a strategy, but it is a very human one. The years after Patton's death did not feel like the beginning of a new war. They felt like recovery. Cities were rebuilt, economies restarted, soldiers returned home. The language of victory slowly gave way to the language of stability. On the surface, it appeared that restraint had worked. But beneath that surface, the world was hardening. The division of Europe, once described as temporary, became structural. Borders drawn in haste became borders defended by ideology. What had been tolerated in the name of peace began to look permanent. The Iron Curtain did not descend all at once. It was assembled piece by piece. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed governments consolidated power. Opposition parties were marginalized, then eliminated. Security services grew. Borders closed. Each step was incremental, justified as necessary, framed as internal affairs. From Washington, the response was measured. Diplomatic protests replaced pressure. Economic aid flowed west, not east. The division deepened. The logic of delay revealed its cost. By the time American policymakers fully accepted that cooperation with the Soviet Union had limits, the balance had changed. The Red Army was no longer exhausted. Soviet industry had recovered. Intelligence networks were entrenched. Influence had solidified. What had once been a moment became a reality. The Cold War did not begin as a conflict of armies, but of endurance. It was a test of systems, economies, and political will, a competition designed to be unwinnable quickly. This was the world Patton had warned about, a world where confrontation was no longer decisive, but prolonged, where victory was measured not in territory gained, but in decades survived, where every crisis carried the risk of escalation without resolution. The Korean War was the first sign. It was limited, indecisive, and costly. A war fought under constraints, with objectives carefully managed to avoid provoking a larger conflict. It was not about winning. It was about not losing control. Germany remained divided. Berlin became a symbol rather than a city. Europe stabilized, but at the cost of permanent tension. By the time nuclear parity emerged, the opportunity for decisive action had vanished completely. Power had equalized. Risk had multiplied. What followed was a balance built on fear rather than leverage. Deterrence replaced dominance. Containment replaced pressure. Management replaced decision. This system prevented immediate catastrophe, but it locked the world into a cycle of crises without resolution. Each generation inherited the consequences of the last delay. From this perspective, Patton's worldview appears less reckless than it once did. He was wrong about many things. He underestimated the political cost of action. He overestimated the willingness of societies to endure another war. But he was right about one thing: time is not neutral. The world that followed his death was not safer. It was simply slower to break. And by the time it did, through proxy wars, revolutions, and nuclear standoffs, the choices had narrowed and the costs had grown. History remembers the Cold War as inevitable. But inevitability often looks different in hindsight than it did in the moment. History does not offer reruns. It does not allow experiments. It records one path, and everything else fades into speculation. But sometimes, asking the final question is the only way to understand what truly mattered. What if George Patton had lived? Not for years, not for another war, just long enough to remain present when the shape of the post-war world was being decided. Would his arguments have prevailed? Almost certainly not. The political momentum toward restraint was powerful. Public exhaustion was real. Another war, even a limited one, would have been nearly impossible to justify. But presence matters. Patton did not need to win the debate to change it. He only needed to force it into the open, to prevent decisions from being made quietly, by default, in the absence of pressure. If Patton had lived, the early Cold War might still have happened, but it might have started differently. Negotiations with the Soviet Union could have been firmer. Red lines might have been clearer. The temporary nature of occupation might have been enforced more aggressively. The cost of expansion might have been raised earlier, when leverage was still decisive. Or perhaps everything would have gone wrong. Perhaps confrontation would have escalated. Perhaps Europe would have burned again. Perhaps Patton's instincts, shaped by battlefield logic, would have failed in a political world. These possibilities cannot be resolved. What can be resolved is this. Patton's death removed a constraint on choice. It narrowed the range of options without acknowledging that it had done so. After he was gone, the United States did not choose delay over action in a vacuum. It chose it in a world where the loudest voice against delay no longer existed. That is how power shifts. Not through assassinations or secret meetings, but through the disappearance of friction, through moments when resistance ends quietly and consensus forms without being tested. Patton did not change the world by what he did after the war. He changed it by not being there. The balance of world power did not tip in a single decision or a single agreement. It tilted slowly, almost imperceptibly, when a man who believed time was the enemy died at exactly the moment time became policy. History remembers battles. It remembers treaties. It remembers leaders who signed documents. It rarely remembers the voices that vanished before the ink dried. And yet, sometimes, it is those vanished voices that tell us the most about the world we inherited.